Next on The Impossible State.
North Korea is the impossible state. It's a place that stumped leaders and policymakers for more than 3 decades. It has a complex history, and it has become the United States' top national security priority. Each week on this show, we'll talk with the people who know the most about North Korea.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Impossible State podcast at CSIS. My name is Victor Cha. I'm your host, president of the Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department, Korea chair at CSIS, and professor at Georgetown University. And today, we're talking about Trump tariffs and how they affect Japan and Korea. But before we begin our discussion, I just wanted to take a minute to remember the passing of a very dear friend of mine personally and of CSIS, and that is former Deputy Secretary of State Richard Armitage. He was a longtime friend of CSIS, a board member of CSIS. I worked with him in government when he was Deputy Secretary of State, and his passing is a big loss for all of us in the U.S. foreign policy community and for folks who work on the Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific. I'll just say that many people knew Rich as a Japan person, and in fact, the famous Armitage-Nye reports that were done on the U.S.-Japan alliance were something that were very closely tied with CSIS. We helped to facilitate a lot of those reports, but all the work and the sort of the brain power behind them belonged to people like Rich Armitage, as well as Professor Nye. But what people don't know is that he was also very much an advocate for the U.S.-Korea alliance as well. That is not as well known about him. And just to give you one example of that, you can all look up in the Washington Post archives an op-ed that Rich Armitage wrote with myself and with our current colleague Mike Green, in which I think the title of it was "Obama Should Go to Korea," because he had a trip to plan to Asia and Korea was not on the itinerary, and it was actually Rich Armitage's idea to write something together on that. And in fact, he did go to Korea on that trip as a result of that. So we miss you all very much, Rich, and our condolences to the family. Okay, so today's discussion is about Trump tariffs and what they mean for Korea and Japan. Unless you've been hiding under a rock somewhere, you would know that this is sort of the story of the day. And we have 2 wonderful people to discuss this issue with today. Christy Gavella, Dr. Christy Gavella, I'm proud to say, is our new senior advisor and Japan chair at CSIS. She is also associate professor of Japanese politics and international relations at the University of Oxford in England, my alma mater. She was previously the inaugural director of the congressionally funded Center for Indo-Pacific Studies at the University of Hawaii. She was also a professor there. She was deputy director for Asia at the German Marshall Fund, and has a long history working on both Japan and Indo-Pacific issues. Also joining us is Bill Reinsch, who, if any of you who follow our podcasts, his voice is ubiquitous these days. They're on the Trade Guys, our other podcast talking about everything that's going on with Trump and tariffs. He is senior advisor and Scholl chair emeritus with the economics program and Scholl chair in international business. Previously, he was Undersecretary of Commerce for Export Administration during the Clinton administration, and also does some teaching of his own at the University of Maryland. So thanks to both of you very much for joining us for today's podcast about Trump tariffs. And I think, Bill, I'd like to start out with you. I know that you've been sort of in the thick of it, since Liberation Day and certainly before. I guess the first question for those of us who look at this from a non-expert perspective is we see, all of these massive tariffs being levied against the world, both partners, allies, as well as competitors. We see a lot of, I guess the polite word is variability in what we're seeing coming out of the Trump administration. Like, how much of this is part of a real new landscape of tariff walls, and how much of it is just illusion or negotiation And also, what is the latest? Like, I don't know what is the latest yet. It changes every hour. So,
well, it does. Are you feeling liberated, Victor? Is that,
yes,
the real question you've asked, the real question is, what's the point? What is this trying to accomplish? There have been from Trump himself and from his various assistants, basically 4 different reasons given for this, and some of them conflict with each other, which makes it very difficult to figure out exactly what's going to happen. One is the rebalancing theory, that we have been treated badly by everybody, friends and allies and adversaries alike, for many years. They're stealing our jobs, undermining our economy, and compromising our security. And basically, we need to get even. We need to rebalance and get them to pay back all the things that we've been paying them for all this time. And that involves tariffs. Trump historically has one narrative, the U.S. is a victim, one metric, the bilateral trade deficit, and one tool, tariffs. And all of that is appearing this time around. So that's one goal. Another goal is, which contradicts that, is this is all a negotiating tool. Let's raise tariffs, and that will force other countries to come in here and basically make concessions to us, and in return, we won't raise our tariffs. And that's a really good deal if you can engineer that, because it means they give up something that we care about, and we give up nothing. All we do is agree not to do what we've said we're going to do. So that's the second goal. The third goal, which doesn't fit either of the first two, is revenue. They need the money because they're trying to extend the tax cuts that expire at the end of this year. And there's a search on for revenue because under our rules, the tax cuts have to be balanced with spending cuts or revenue increases somewhere else. And this would not, our current estimate in the economics department, based on the latest set of revisions, is that they'll bring in around $220 billion a year. That's not nearly enough to offset the tax cuts, but it's not peanuts either. Of course, if you think about it, if you're bringing in revenue, then you want the tariffs to remain. And so if you're trying to negotiate the tariffs away, which is the other objective, then the consequence of that is no revenue. So these are kind of irreconcilable goals. The fourth one is he wants to bring manufacturing back to the United States. And I think this is core in his thinking. He really believes that we have lost our manufacturing base over the years. When I wrote a column on this, I borrowed from the Ronnie Milsap song, Lost in the 50s Tonight. And there he is. Actually, there is Joe Biden, too. They're both in the 50s because they want to bring back classic heavy manufacturing, steel, cars, machinery. That's what they focus on. And they want to bring it back. And they believe that tariffs are a way to do that. Biden wanted to bring it back, too. He was a carrot guy. Let's bribe them to come back. Let's offer incentives. Trump is a stick guy. Let's punish them or threaten them and say, if you don't come back, you'll pay tariffs. And he said many times, if you make it here, there's no tariff. So the question is, which is the real goal and what's going to happen? And these things have changed so many times, it's very difficult to predict. They've been on, off, up, down, postponed. First, there were going to be no exceptions, and now there may be some exceptions. And every afternoon he signs new executive orders and talks to the press, and he muses about these things. The latest was now he's thinking about giving the auto companies a break without being too clear about exactly what that break is. Friday night they exempted semiconductors and a boatload of downstream electronic products, computers, phones, laptops, computers, other electronic things that contain chips. And then announced on Sunday that that wasn't really an exemption, that was a temporary postponement because they'll be captured later on by other tariffs. So it's a moving target. Nobody knows exactly what's going to happen. And the result of that has been really monumental uncertainty, because if you don't know what's going to happen, I mean, you can't even project 3 months. The tariffs that he imposed on April 2nd have all been postponed, except for the 10% flat rate. Will they come back in 3 months? Will they continue to be 10%? Will they come back at different levels than what was originally headlined? If you have a supply chain, if you're an American manufacturer and have a supply chain that involves foreign parts and components, which is most of them, it's really impossible to make a decision about what you're supposed to do. And so right now, I think most companies are, after they got past the panic mode, are waiting for the dust to settle to try to figure out what the appropriate next step is.
Interesting. So every component, every product has a foreign manufacturing component, except our radio here, because this is from the 1950s, and it's all American. We just want everybody.
It's also not plugged in, Victor. I see that.
We don't want to say anything about operating, right? But I mean, so a couple of things. The first is I just want to draw folks' attention to, I think you did a report where you talked about on this fourth objective, that even if Trump were successful in bringing this manufacturing back to the United States, we don't have the labor force to support it. Right?
We don't have the labor force, and there's also a timing issue. On the labor force, yes, we did a paper that came out last November that looked at, we stayed away from the high-tech PhD engineer issue, and we just focused on 4 basic parts of the economy: construction, transportation, agriculture, and healthcare. And what we found were 6-digit job shortages in all of those sectors. We don't have enough construction workers. We don't have enough truck drivers. We don't have enough people picking fruits and vegetables. We don't have enough people picking lettuce. We don't have enough nurse practitioners. We don't have enough healthcare workers in general. And the demographics actually are approaching, they're not approaching, but they're heading in the same direction as Japan and Korea. Our birth rate is below the replacement rate. We've avoided shrinkage for decades based on immigration. We are now pursuing an immigration policy which is going to deport all those people, which leaves the question of, if you're going to create all these jobs, where are the workers? And particularly in the United States, where are the workers that want to pick lettuce or want to engage in manufacturing jobs? Where are the workers that want to make steel? We had a high school group here visiting last week, and I asked them that question. How many of you envision your future on the assembly line? And the answer was nobody. I assume they all want to be TikTok influencers, but which is probably not a realistic objective either. But they're not looking for the kind of jobs that Trump wants to create. The other problem is timing. The tariffs go into effect now, or in a week, or next month, or in 3 months. It varies and changes. But the short answer is soon. If you're going to build a factory or even reopen one, you can't do that between now and June.
Sure.
It just doesn't work. The classic example is Stellantis, which used to be Chrysler in the United States, which makes Jeep, among other things, announced last year they were going to reopen a factory in Illinois. So it's already there. They're going to retool, reopen. Their start date is 2027. So 3 years simply to reopen and retool something that is already there. If you're talking about building new, you have to talk about zoning, you have to talk about local, state, federal regulations, you have to talk about environmental impact statements, you have to talk about all these things to slow things down. And Trump sort of says, well, we're going to get rid of all those. He can speak for that at the federal level up to a point, but a lot of this is local, and immediately if you want to build a big plant, particularly one that has a lot of emissions, then the neighbors come in and the neighbors say, this is not a good idea. So we have a time problem here where people are paying the tariffs soon, and the action that Trump wants them to take to mitigate that is years down the road.
Yeah. Yeah, so very interesting. Let's shift over to Asia, and Christy, ask you, how are allies responding? How are both Japan and Korea have already had interaction with the Trump administration on this? Maybe you could sort of give us your views on how Japan in particular is responding, and also maybe say a little bit about how you see their response compared to all these other countries that have been tariffed and how they are responding.
So in the case of Japan, I think you see kind of three major categories of response. The first has really been to the domestic audiences in Japan. So Ishiba has really framed this as a national crisis and is calling for unity amongst the parties to deal with it. And so you've seen things like very practical measures to open up something like 1,000 consultative centers around Japan to help small businesses figure out what to do about these tariffs. They've been taking steps to make state-backed loans more accessible to businesses. And the various parties have been coming forward with proposals to try to cushion the impacts on consumers. So they've been talking about things like perhaps lowering the consumption tax or coming up with some kind of stimulus funds. So that has been a big part, is just how this is going to affect Japan and what they're going to do in response to this, which is a big part of the political story for the Japanese government. The second part has really been dealing with the U.S. directly, of course. And Ishiba has been in contact with Trump. He has appointed a negotiator to interact with Besant, and his appointee is a fellow who is in charge of economic revitalization. His name is Akazawa, and he's a close ally of Ishiba. And the idea here is that Japan is going to try and get a good deal for itself. It's going to try and make a case that Japan has done a lot for the economy of the U.S. and that it has a lot to contribute. And so that is something that we'll hear more about later this week. And then the third major thing, I think, has been Japan reaching out to other countries to basically make common cause for trying to preserve the trade order and trying to find a way to protect the relatively open, free flow of goods that they feel is very important to the Japanese economy. So you see Japan really moving forward on all of those fronts. I think that in comparison to some other countries, what's notable is you don't hear Japan talking about retaliation. In some statements made by Japanese politicians or officials, they've said that it's not necessarily off the table, but it really isn't something that Japan is considering seriously. And this is, of course, in large part due to the fact that Japan is a major U.S. ally and is very reliant on the U.S. for its security. So retaliation does not really seem to be an option for Japan in terms of its overall foreign policy portfolio, and it's not something that they're willing to risk for either the economic or the security consequences. You see this, of course, is very different in the case of China, which has retaliated, or in the case of Europe as well. I think they're more willing to discuss retaliation, although they have not necessarily pulled the trigger on that, partly because they feel like they have more latitude, or perhaps they are already losing more in their relative security negotiations with the U.S. So it's a very distinctive response from Japan, I think.
So I'll just say on that's all very interesting, and I want to ask you also about apparently there will be elections at some point this summer and what impact that has. But let me just say on the Korea side, we're seeing a very similar sort of reaction on the part of Korea. First, there was for 4.5 months no reaction because the government was basically stymied by an impeachment crisis. But literally, like a couple of days or even a day after the decision was made to impeach the South Korean president, the acting president was able to get a call with President Trump and talk about trying to find a pathway forward, put some people on an airplane. They're here in D.C. now trying to negotiate some sort of deal. So very similar reactions by Japan and South Korea, which are more about, all right, let's figure out a way to work with this versus what we see from what the EU is talking about and what China has certainly done in terms of response. But of course, South Korea has elections in June. I would imagine whoever takes that job would love for this problem to be behind them when they start office. Unlikely that's going to be the case. But Japan also has elections most likely this summer. And so what is the potential impact there? Or even if Ishiba may not make it through, right? He may not make it through this summer, so.
At this point, I think that the foreign policy uncertainty is playing a role in Japanese domestic politics, but it seems like Ishiba may be the one to have to sort of deal with this problem up until the election. I think it's difficult to say, just because there's so much uncertainty about what's going to happen, how it will all play out. But it's certainly true that the risks of coming forward as a potential Japanese political leader right now are certainly high, and there's a lot of downside. So I think think that we'll tend to see Ishiba try to muddle through this situation until the July upper house elections. But then there'll be some discussion about whether a new leader might come to the forefront to try to perhaps make a case for a new vision of leadership. But I think right now, a lot of Japanese people are looking at the different opposition parties and wondering, is it really the time to take a risk on a different kind of leader, or would it be better to stay the course given all of the uncertainties around Trump, around trade, and also around security? So I think that those factors tend to suggest more stability and perhaps a little bit more leaning towards the LDP, despite all of the domestic dissatisfaction with them due to domestic scandals and such.
Do you think, and I'd like both of you to weigh in on this question, do you think, like, if you're the leadership in Japan or Korea right now, like, all you're basically trying to do is sort of, get some, in the near term, get some sort of deal done, and just kind of, like you said, like, people aren't going to make huge decisions about moving manufacturing and everything because things are so uncertain right now. They're just kind of trying to muddle through for as long as they can. Maybe like the goalpost right now is like the midterm elections, like just make it through to the midterms in the United States and then see where the policy goes. I mean, or are they really seeing this as the new reality and like we have to cut a deal with Trump to get rid of what was Japan's 25% or 24%, whatever it might be, or is it really just everybody's just kind of trying to cope and delay? Oh.
Well, it's really damage limitation at this point. Nobody's going to come out of this unscathed. I mean, companies have realized that, if your supply chain manager is any good right now, you've already got best price, best quality, and best delivery, which are the traditional values. So what you're going to be forced to do if you're forced to alter your supply chains to make them more American, no matter who you are or where you are, you're going to come up with something that is more expensive and less efficient. So it's damage limitation. I think for countries, it's sort of hope for the best but prepare for the worst. There's a lot of talk about is this the end of the trading system as we know it and the end of globalization? And I'm in the group that thinks that's not the case. Partly because the tools that enable economic integration haven't gone away. Enormous reductions in the cost of transportation and communication, the digitization of the economy, that's all still here. The connections are still here, so they'll continue to be used. And what we are beginning to see, and Christy just mentioned it, is other countries beginning to talk to each other about relationships that bypass the United States. What gives me a modicum of hope is that a lot of that discussion is very traditional. It says, let's talk about free trade agreements. Let's talk about in a traditional approach, the old way we used to do it, without the United States. So Europe is talking more. They're trying to make sure that Mercosur gets done. They're talking more to the Mexicans. The Canadians are trying to make more of the existing Canada-EU deal. There's discussions amongst Southeast Asian nations. So there's a lot of ferment going on, which has not produced anything yet. It's too soon. But it's, let's develop workarounds because, the United States may be this way for at least 4 years and maybe longer.
On that, Christy, there were reports that China, Japan, and Korea sort of restarted, after like a 4 or 5 year hiatus, restarted talks on a trilateral free trade agreement. Like, I don't know how far those things are going to go, but like it goes to your point earlier about sort of making common cause with others, so what else is Japan doing in that respect?
Well, I mean, just to echo what Bill was saying, I think that Japan is really trying to look for other countries that believe that there is something worth preserving in all of these trade agreements. And this parallels what we saw back when the U.S. withdrew from TPP. I mean, one of the things that Japan did, besides working with others to help shepherd that into the CPTPP, was to sign a trade agreement deal with the EU, which it had been talking about for a long time, with the UK. So I think by reaching out to other partners like Japan and China, China, Japan sees this as an opportunity to help shore up the trading system through other deals. And this shouldn't really be read as an alternative to the U.S., but more as they see it as supporting the world trade system. Right now, we're not making any progress in the WTO, et cetera. So these kinds of things are the way that countries can basically solidify and institutionalize trade practices and rules.
Yeah, I have to say on the Japan, Korea, China thing, I'm a skeptic. I mean, you're right. They've been talking about this for years without much progress. And I mean, it's complicated because they're neighbors and there's enormous amount of history amongst all three of them. But in economic terms, the Chinese economy is, it's this 800-pound gorilla next door, but it's also the system they use is really incompatible with the Japanese and Korean economics. And it's very hard for me to see a deal being struck, but you may know more about that than I do.
I don't know more about it, but it's not going to stop me from making a point, which is, you remember back when we did Chorus and we talked about TPP. Everybody used to look down on sort of RCEP because they said that this wasn't sort of a high quality free trade agreement. It was just superficially about lowering tariffs on certain products in certain areas. It wasn't like deeply penetrating labor and environment and all these other things. Like a RCEP type agreement that just focused on lowering tariffs in certain areas, that's like not such a bad thing today, right? That doesn't sound like such a bad thing given where we are today. The bar's certainly gotten lower. And so I don't know if something even, I agree with you that like the media played this up as the country striking back. That wasn't what it was. There is, as you said, there's an opportunity to reach out, find common cause with others to try to preserve the trading order. It's ironic that China is now seen as a partner in that, in some sense. But even like that sort of, I agree, it's hard to reach an agreement of that nature, but given where we are today, like a simple, good old-fashioned free trade agreement that just lowered tariff barriers, not non-tariff barriers, not labor, not environment, that, relatively speaking, wouldn't be a bad thing these days. But
no, it would be a shot in the arm for the trading system, and for the WTO. So
right. So where is the WTO these days in all of this?
Well, MIA for the most part.
Yeah.
Although I wouldn't say that's because of Trump. The United States continues to participate. It's been very hard for them to reach multilateral agreements, and I have to say, frankly, that the biggest problem there has not been the United States, it's not been China, it's been India, which objects to almost everything, and not only objects to multilateral agreements, but has objected to the incorporation of agreements that they haven't participated in into WTO rules. What the WTO has done in the face of the opposition from India and South Africa and one or two others, Nicaragua and Venezuela also come to mind, has been to go to what they call joint statement initiatives, which are essentially plurilateral agreements, coalitions of the willing. If you want to make more progress on e-commerce, let's get together and see what we can do. And there have been a few of those. There was the Information Technology Agreement, and there just was one on investment facilitation, which is not rules about what you have to let in, but rules about how to make investment easier, that quite 120 odd countries signed and participated in, not the United States, incidentally, and not India. But they agreed to it. It was finished, and 120 countries is not peanuts. And so then the moment came, can we take that text and put it into the WTO rules, like the government procurement agreement, like the information technology agreement? And India objected because their position is that negotiation should only be multilateral with everybody. And of course, they block those too. So I think they're MIA for other reasons. And I'm pessimistic. I'd like to think that we'll get to a better place. And perhaps if they can revitalize the dispute settlement system, which has also fallen into disrepair, and that one the United States did have something to do with, if they can bring that back, that may help restore things. But what has happened that's interesting is developing countries have started to tell the Indians, you're really not speaking for us. You're blocking things that matter to us. There was a famous, actually, blow-up in the last ministerial between the Indians and the Thai ambassador, who said to the Indians, "You're hurting our farmers. Your rice policies are hurting our farmers. This is, you're not helping developing countries." The Indians were so upset they demanded the recall of the Thai ambassador over that. But it's a sign that I think other countries have realized that that the Indians are not always speaking for everybody, everybody in the South's interest. But it's still, short-term prospects are not bright.
Okay. Let me just shift to one other topic, which is what is the so Japan and Korea have a lot of foreign direct investment in the United States. In the past 4 years, in particular, we've seen dramatic increases in a lot of states in the South, and as well in the West. Christy, how do you think? I guess the question is, how does not just the tariffs, but the overall Trump administration's, I like to say that they're strategically, they are quite predictable because there are things that Trump has believed in for a long time, like this question of merchandise trade deficits, but they're tactically quite unpredictable, right? And so how, from the Japan perspective, how do they look at that unpredictability when it comes to thinking about investment, and in particular new investments? Ishiba came here, it was in January, he talked about $1 trillion of investment in the United States. But that was, of course, before we saw this rollout of this tariff policy. So just curious about your thoughts on that, and also, Bill, in general, your thoughts on both these super high tariffs and also the unpredictability as it affects investment decisions by foreign countries in the United States.
So clearly there's a lot of uncertainty right now, but many Japanese companies, as you said, have already invested very strongly in the U.S. And so if you look at some surveys of business sentiment, we see that, many of them are planning to keep those investments and perhaps to increase them. And, if that gets them around tariffs, that will be seen as positive. Many, unfortunately, had also invested in Mexico as a way of, investing in the U.S. Through NAFTA, et cetera. And so that they consider to be a very reliable strategy and has not proved to be so. So I think that, looking at these kinds of kind of shifting rules is worrying. So in the short term, I think companies are trying to leverage the assets they have in the U.S. and perhaps, find ways to increase. But I think in the medium to long term, they're wondering about how reliable this is. Can they find other markets? It is very difficult to do so, though. So I think they're kind of trapped. But there is a sense that, they don't really know what to expect from the U.S. And if there were promises made for example, incentives under the Biden administration, those were not necessarily to be relied upon under the next administration. So I think, it's a difficult business environment. But in general, I think that companies are trying to maintain or leverage things in the short term to try to get around these tariffs.
But my sense is that it is a difficult business environment, but at the same time, it seems like the government is being given some political space, right? I mean, the public is not, they're not up in arms like, let's retaliate, right? There are upper house elections, but as you said, is there really somebody who wants to step into this at this particular point? So there's more political space, even though it's a very complicated business environment.
Right. Yeah. So if you look at polls of the Japanese public, actually, most Japanese people believe that they will be affected by Trump's tariffs, but actually a very small percentage actually favor retaliation. So I think that the Japanese government in that sense does have room. I mean, I think people were disappointed with Ishiba because there was this sense that maybe he should have been able to get an exemption preemptively. I think personally, I think that's an unreasonable expectation for him. But I think that the Japanese public is aware that it's a difficult situation. They do want to see results. They do want to have their economic welfare protected. But there is space for the government to find a solution within that.
Yeah, and Bill, on this question of tariffs and foreign direct investment, your thoughts on that, but also what Christy raises. During the first Trump administration, there was basically a playbook that all the world leaders used, which was to come in, to meet with Trump, to flatter him, to provide a big package of goodies, and then they could pretty much get out damage-free. But, that certainly doesn't seem to be working just yet. So your thoughts on tariffs and investment, and then your
Yeah.
thoughts on the playbook. So
On investment, I think, I agree with Christy. The best talking points the Japanese and the Koreans have is the substantial amount of investment they've already made. Japan is number one, Korea is up there. And I'm sure what will be on the table when they come in to have a discussion is how much more can you invest? And then we'll see what they have to say. But they have a very good record on that. And I think that's something that they should draw on. Companies are going to wait and see what happens, and companies have to calculate, like I said, plan for the worst. But what is the worst? Is it 4 years? Trump can't run again, maybe. But even if he can't, he'll make sure that the next candidate from his party shares his views, and it may be Vance or it may be somebody else. We'll see. But so this could go on longer. I think it's going to be a lengthy period of uncertainty. The thing to keep in mind is that the only people that have retaliated so far really are China and Canada on autos, and the EU pretty clearly is going to, but has been, every time Trump postpones, they postpone too. So most countries are not retaliating, and I think I wouldn't put out to pasture the Trump 1.0 strategy that you described. It still works with some refinements. And I think if you want to see how it was done so far anyway, masterfully, it was with the Mexican president, Claudia Sheinbaum. And she followed a three-part strategy. Part one was assert your sovereignty politely, don't poke him in the eye. You need to do that for domestic political purposes. Two, make small concessions, preferably ones you've made before, and hope that nobody remembers. And three, the important one is let him win. Because my observation has been, more often than not, the act of winning is more important than the substance of what he wins. What he really wants is the press conference, the White House Oval Office appearance where he's saying, I win, they surrendered, we're great. And the question of what exactly did you win kind of gets pushed to the side. We saw this with China in the first term, where he went in with big demands, in fact, the same demands that previous presidents had made, and ended up with them agreeing to buy a bunch of stuff, which they then didn't do anyway. And one of the press conference questions was, well, what about all these things you wanted? And the answer was, well, that's in phase two, which never happened. I think you're going to see more of that. I think you're going to be, if countries understand that it's not just flattery, it's letting him win. Right. Because for him, these things are zero sum. He doesn't win unless somebody has to lose in order for him to win, which is not the way most trade agreements work. Most trade agreements are win-win. How do you figure out how we both get something? I think the Scheinbaum strategy has worked well, and I think you're going to see more countries doing that. And if you think about it from Trump's point of view, maybe it doesn't matter if they give everything. If they give something, I really do win, because I'm not giving up anything.
Yeah. Well, that reminds me of, I think it was on one of your other, on the Trade Guys podcast, which you should all also listen to on CSIS. Either you or Scott made the point that Trump is not wired for trade negotiations because he's wired as a real estate guy where there are winners and losers, and trade is a win-win game, right? It's a positive-sum game, not a zero-sum game. So that's an interesting observation on which to conclude. Certainly a lot more to talk about. I hope to have you guys both back on again in the future. Thank you all for watching another episode of The Impossible State, and we'll see you again soon.